How much did it cost to sell one's freedom in exchange for a title and a diamond tiara that weighed heavier than shackles? We are accustomed to admiring portraits of ladies from the age of splendor, seeing only silk, jewels, and serene smiles frozen in oil. However, behind the walls of the stately mansions of Fifth Avenue and the cold English castles lay a very different reality, full of silence and despair. Women whose names graced the society columns often found themselves in a golden cage, the keys to which were in their husbands' pockets. Their lives turned into an endless performance where any mistake could cost them their reputation, and they had no voice at all. Marriage at that time was not a union of two hearts, but a harsh commercial transaction in which feelings were considered an unaffordable luxury and weakness. Watch the video to the end to find out how luxurious interiors became the backdrop for personal tragedies and why many of these women realized the true cost of their glamorous marriages too late. What if I told you that everything you believed about the romance of balls was a lie? The social season, described in novels as a series of parties and dances, was in fact a tightly organized exchange. Young girls, barely out of their parents' homes, were put on display for all to see, like expensive merchandise in the window of an upscale store. They were taught not the sciences or the art of thinking, but how to hold a fan correctly, smile at the right people, and hide their true emotions behind a mask of politeness. Mothers and aunts, acting as managers, carefully selected candidates, evaluating their bank accounts and pedigrees rather than their human qualities. In this scheme, the girl was just a pawn whose task was to exchange her youth and beauty for the social status of her family. No one asked her opinion about a groom who could be twice her age, have a bad temper, or be unattractive. The main criteria for success were the amount of annual income and social status that a man could offer his future wife. Romantic dreams drawn from books were shattered by the cold calculation of marriage contracts, which specified the terms of maintenance but did not mention love. Preparing to go out in society was like military drill, where every movement was honed to perfection to rule out any possibility of error. Dresses that weighed kilograms, corsets that made it impossible to breathe, and elaborate hairstyles were not adornments, but uniforms that had to be worn with dignity. In ballrooms flooded with the light of gas lamps, an atmosphere of competition reigned, where one wrong glance could ruin the prospects for a successful marriage. Girls learned to see other women not as friends, but as rivals ready to snatch up a good match. Men, on the other hand, came to these balls as buyers, choosing the best acquisition for their estate or city residence. They were not looking for a partner or a conversation companion, but a beautiful addition to their status, capable of wearing the family jewels with dignity. Marriage was seen as a merger of capital, a union of lands, or a way to improve the shaky financial situation of the old aristocracy with new money. The emotional connection between spouses was not only ignored, it was often considered vulgar and unnecessary in high society. No one warned these girls about what awaited them beyond the threshold of the marital bedroom and in everyday life with a stranger. The education they received was aimed at making them pleasant, but not at understanding the reality of relationships. The illusion of choice created by balls and receptions vanished as soon as the documents were signed. A woman realized that her fate was now completely in the hands of a man she barely knew. They understood that they were merely a tool for achieving the social goals of their families. Disappointment did not come immediately, but when it did, it was already impossible to change anything. I would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how the economic background of marriage affected the psyche of women at that time? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what happened when the lights went out at the wedding celebration? The first night and subsequent married life often came as a real shock to women of the Gilded Age, for which no one had prepared them. Victorian morality placed a taboo on discussing the physical side of relationships, leaving girls completely in the dark. A husband who seemed like a gallant gentleman at balls often turned into a demanding master in private. For many women, marital duty became a heavy responsibility, devoid of any romance or tenderness. In such an atmosphere, a woman quickly realized that her feelings and experiences were of no interest to anyone and had to be hidden. She learned to wear a mask of contentment, even when inside she was consumed by anguish and misunderstanding. Complaining was not acceptable, as it could cast a shadow on the family's reputation and cause public condemnation. All that remained was to endure and find solace in small things that could not replace real human warmth. For women who dreamed of love and partnership, this reality shattered all their youthful hopes. They discovered that marriage did not bring them the promised happiness, but only imposed new, heavy shackles. Instead of a friend and protector, they got a supervisor who controlled their every move. The coldness of the relationship was reflected in the interiors, which seemed icy and lifeless. The isolation within marriage was worse than physical loneliness, as it took place in front of everyone. The woman was surrounded by people, but no one could or wanted to understand her inner drama. She was locked into a role that had been imposed on her, with no possibility of improvisation or change. Life turned into an endless wait for something that would never come. Over time, her heart hardened, and the woman herself turned into a cold statue, matching the atmosphere of her home. She learned not to feel, not to wait, and not to hope, so as not to experience the pain of disappointment. It was a defensive reaction of the psyche to the unbearable conditions of emotional vacuum. In the next chapter, you will learn how the architecture of houses itself became an instrument of oppression and control. Want to know a secret that will change your life and your idea of comfort? The layout of the luxurious mansions of the Gilded Age was not accidental. It was specifically designed to separate people. Huge spaces, long corridors, and enfilades of rooms were created not for comfort, but to demonstrate status and maintain distance. The women's quarters were often located far from the men's, physically reinforcing the emotional divide between spouses. To simply see her husband, a wife had to traverse dozens of meters of corridors and staircases, making spontaneous communication impossible. The rooms were filled with heavy furniture, velvet curtains, and many fragile items that required caution. It was impossible to relax in such an interior. One had to constantly maintain good posture and watch every movement. The house resembled a museum where exhibits had a place, but living people did not, and the woman was the chief curator of this museum. Personal space was conditional, as servants or family members could enter at any moment. The staircases in these mansions were grandiose, but for a woman in a heavy dress, climbing them was a real physical challenge. The architecture dictated the manner of movement, slow, majestic, and extremely tiring. It was impossible to simply run downstairs. One had to walk, demonstrating the grandeur of the family. The house required its mistress to be constantly on display, even when there was no audience nearby. Libraries and studies were traditionally considered male territory, where women were only allowed to enter by invitation. This deprived them of access to intellectual life and emphasized their secondary position. Women were assigned to the living room or salon, where they were expected to embroider or receive guests. The space of the home clearly delineated spheres of influence, leaving women with only decorative functions. Even the gardens and parks on estates were designed so that walks were regulated and visible. There were no secluded corners where one could be alone without fear of prying eyes. The house became a golden cage in the literal sense, where luxury served as the bars of the cage. Interiors designed to arouse the envy of others caused only melancholy in their inhabitants. The silk-covered walls could not warm the soul, and the high ceilings prevented them from breathing freely. Like this, if you also feel how oppressive this atmosphere was, even through the description. Guess how long it took to create this impression of perfect order? Being the mistress of a large house at that time meant working yourself to exhaustion, performing the duties of a top manager of a huge corporation. The woman was responsible for everything from planning the weekly menu to keeping track of the accounts and supervising the numerous servants. It was not leisure, but hard daily labor that required attention to 1,000 details and constant tension. At the same time, this work was taken for granted, never paid, and rarely appreciated by her husband. Every morning began with meetings with the housekeeper and cook, where the details of dinners and receptions were discussed. The slightest mistake in seating guests or choosing dishes could cause a scandal and damage the family's reputation. The hostess had to know the tastes of all important guests, remember their diets and preferences, so as not to make any mistakes. This required a phenomenal memory and diplomatic skills, worthy of an ambassador. The financial side of things often fell on the woman's shoulders. Even though legally the husband controlled the money, she had to balance debits and credits within the allocated budget, accounting for every cent spent. This created a humiliating dependence and the need to ask for money for necessary household needs. Women often had to resort to tricks to save money and find funds for personal expenses. Social obligations were also part of the job. Courtesy visits, charity committees, correspondence. Not responding to a letter or not returning a visit was considered a gross violation of etiquette. The day was scheduled down to the minute, and this schedule left almost no time for oneself. Life became an endless list of tasks to be crossed off. By old age, many women felt burned out and drained by this endless race. They had spent their lives serving the comfort of others and maintaining the status of others. Looking back, all they saw were endless menus, bills, and guest lists. Do you think it was fair to call such a life idle? In the next chapter, you will learn how society punished those who tried to break these rules. The fear of making a mistake was a constant companion for women of high society, poisoning their every day. Reputation was a fragile vessel that could be shattered by a single careless word or action. The society of the Gilded Age was a ruthless judge, unforgiving of even the slightest deviation from established norms. Women lived with the feeling that they were constantly being watched by hundreds of eyes, ready to notice any mistake. The wrong choice of dress, laughter that was too loud, or a conversation with a man that lasted a little longer than it should have could become the subject of gossip. Rumors spread with incredible speed, becoming embellished with fictitious details and destroying a good name. Once a reputation was ruined, it could not be restored, and this was akin to a social death sentence. A woman could turn from the queen of the ball into an outcast whom no one noticed overnight. The most terrible punishment was the cut, complete ignorance from society, when acquaintances pretended not to see you. This meant that the doors of all respectable houses were closed and invitations stopped coming. Social death was a reality that was more frightening than physical illness or poverty. A woman found herself in a vacuum, cut off from the circle of friends that gave meaning to her life. The pressure to conform to the ideal was enormous and never let up for a moment. One had to always look impeccable, be up to date with the latest news but not appear too intelligent. Balancing on the edge between modesty and social glamour was an art that required constant self-control. The slightest relaxation could be interpreted as a sign of weakness or depravity. Women themselves became harsh censors of each other, supporting this system of fear. By condemning those who slipped up, they confirmed their own virtue and security. Friendships were often superficial, based on mutual benefit and fear of exclusion from the circle. Sincerity was dangerous, as a confided secret could be used against you. Even within the family, a woman could not feel completely safe from condemnation. Her husband could be the first to reproach her for not living up to standards and damaging the family honor. The responsibility for the family's social success rested on the wife's shoulders, and any failures were blamed on her. She was the showcase of her husband's success, and that showcase had no right to be cracked. Living under the scrutiny of public opinion deprived women of their right to individuality and self-expression. They became functions, a set of correct gestures and phrases, devoid of a living soul. It was an existence of constant tension that drained her strength and killed her joy. Few dared to challenge this system, and the price of such courage was high. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries as an example of a happy marriage. But it was the norm at the time. The phenomenon of dollar princesses became one of the most dramatic pages in the history of the Gilded Age. Wealthy American heiresses married impoverished British aristocrats en masse, trading their fathers millions for titles. Girls accustomed to the comforts of New York, with its central heating and running water, found themselves in medieval conditions. They dreamed of becoming duchesses, but became prisoners of icy stone bags. Husbands, having gained access to the dowry, often lost all interest in their wives, returning to their hobbies and mistresses. The money went to pay off card debts, maintain stables, and restore the estate, rather than to the needs of the wife. The woman understood that she was simply being used as a financial resource to save a dying family line. She was not a beloved wife, but an investor deprived of the right to have a say in the management of her investments. The cultural gap between dynamic America and conservative England was an insurmountable chasm. American women were accustomed to greater freedom of communication, laughter, and openness, which was considered indecent in England. Their attempts to bring life to the gloomy halls were met with fierce resistance and condemnation. They were forced to break themselves, adapting to centuries-old traditions and rules that were alien to them. Their loneliness was compounded by homesickness for their homeland across the ocean and the inability to see their relatives often. Letters took weeks to arrive, and visits were rare and difficult to arrange. The women found themselves completely isolated, surrounded by people who spoke the same language but did not understand them. Many of them fell into deep depression, unable to find a way out of their situation. Some tried to buy love and respect by generously spending money on charity and gifts, but this rarely helped. They were perceived as a source of benefits, but not as equals, with an arrogant distance maintained. The title of Countess or Duchess did not bring happiness, but only imposed new, heavy responsibilities. The glitter of the crown could not compensate for the emotional coldness and contempt. The fates of women such as Consuelo Vanderbilt became symbols of this tragic bargain between the new and old worlds. Behind the beautiful facade of an aristocratic marriage lay tears, humiliation, and broken dreams. Wealth did not protect them from misfortune, and titles did not replace human warmth. The dollar princesses paid too high a price for their crowns. The story of these marriages is the story of the greatest disappointment of an entire generation of the world's richest brides. They sought a fairy tale, but found the cold reality of calculation and cynicism. In the next chapter, you will learn how these experiences affected the physical health of these women. Constant nervous tension, the inability to express their feelings, and physical restrictions led to the destruction of their health. Women of the Gilded Age suffered en masse from ailments that doctors of the time grouped under the vague terms nerves or hysteria. In reality, these were psychosomatic reactions of the body to unbearable living conditions. The body rebelled against corsets that squeezed the organs and against the soul that was trapped in the vice of etiquette. Fainting, paleness, and constant fatigue became not just symptoms, but a kind of fashion, a sign of refinement. A healthy, rosy-cheeked, and active woman was considered vulgar and insufficiently aristocratic in the eyes of society. Weakness was cultivated as proof of a sensitive nature in high birth. However, behind this fashion lay real suffering and physical pain. The lack of physical activity and fresh air also affected the condition of the body. Walks were short and dignified, and sports were considered an inappropriate activity for a lady. Muscles atrophied, blood circulation was disrupted, leading to constant fatigue. Women lived in a state of chronic oxygen deprivation and physical inactivity. Male doctors often did not take women's complaints seriously, attributing everything to female nature. Treatment was limited to recommendations to get more rest and not worry, which was impossible in their situation. Real health problems were ignored until they became critical. Medicine at that time was patriarchal and often cruel to women. Psychological pressure led to eating disorders, although such terms did not exist at the time. Refusal to eat, or conversely, overeating, became ways of controlling one's body. It was an attempt to regain power over at least something in a life where others made all the decisions. The body became a battlefield on which women lost the war with society. The result was sad. Many women faded away in their prime, becoming shadows of their former selves. Their beauty withered, their eyes dimmed, and their vitality drained away without a trace. Wealth could not buy health, especially when the cause of the illness was the lifestyle itself. The golden cage killed its inhabitants slowly but surely. Paradoxically, for many women of the Gilded Age, the death of their husbands was not the end, but the beginning of real life. Widowhood was the only socially acceptable status that gave a woman relative freedom and independence. Taking off her mourning veil, she discovered that for the first time she could dispose of herself, her money, and her time. A widow gained legal rights that a married woman was deprived of, becoming the head of the family. Of course, mourning etiquette was strict and required the observance of many rituals and the wearing of black for years. However, behind these external restrictions lay the opportunity to escape the tyranny of her husband. A woman no longer had to account for her every move or endure coldness or infidelity. She became the mistress of her own destiny as far as was possible in that society. Many widows blossomed, discovering talents for managing estates and finances. They remodeled their homes to their liking, traveled, and did what they really enjoyed. Freed from constant pressure and criticism, they gained self-confidence. Society treated wealthy widows with respect and even some apprehension. Of course, there were those who sincerely mourned, but even they eventually found comfort in their new status. Widowhood gave a woman the right to peace and solitude if she wanted it. No one demanded that she be the centerpiece of the living room or the organizer of endless receptions anymore. She could simply live, breathe, and be herself. History knows many examples of merry widows who, after the death of their tyrants, began to live life to the fullest. They traveled around Europe, had affairs, and enjoyed life, making up for lost time. It was their revenge for years of oppression and silence. Society condemned them, but could do nothing about it. A widow was an untouchable figure. Thus, the death of a husband often became the only way out of the labyrinth of restrictions and obligations. For many, the black color of mourning became the color of freedom and hope. This is the sad irony of that era. In order to start living, a woman had to bury the one who was supposed to be her support. Freedom came through loss. Unable to openly protest against their fate, women found ways to quietly rebel. While outwardly remaining submissive and ideal wives, they created a secret world inside their golden cage. It was a space to which neither their husbands, society, nor servants had access. Reading forbidden or inappropriate books became an act of intellectual disobedience. Novels, philosophy, and social treatises opened up horizons that were inaccessible in real life. Keeping diaries was another form of resistance and preservation of one's own self. On paper, women poured out their souls, describing their true feelings, anger, and disappointment. These records, often destroyed before death, were the only witnesses to their real lives. The diary became a silent companion and friend who would never betray them. Some were fascinated by spiritualism and mysticism, which was extremely popular at the end of the 19th century. Spiritualist seances gave the illusion of power over the invisible world and the opportunity to break strict religious dogmas. In a dark room, holding hands, women felt part of something mysterious and important. It was a form of escapism, a way to escape the gray and cold reality. Trips to the waters to treat non-existent illnesses were a way to escape the routine of home life. At resorts, the regime was milder, and there were more opportunities for socializing. There one could taste freedom, albeit temporary and limited by medical prescriptions. Returning home was always perceived as a return to prison. This quiet rebellion did not lead to revolutions, but it helped women survive and stay sane. They built their own inner castle, impenetrable to the outside world. It was a struggle for the right to remain an individual in conditions of complete powerlessness. Their strength lay not in loud words, but in fortitude. Looking at the formal portraits of Gilded Age ladies today, we often do not see the pain hidden beneath the layers of varnish. Artists such as Sargent and Boldini masterfully conveyed the sheen of silk and the luster of pearls, creating an idealized image. But if you look closely into the eyes of these women, you can see a shadow of deep sadness and fatigue. These paintings are not just images, but documents of an era that captured the triumph of form over substance. They left us a legacy of stately mansions, which have now become museums or offices. Walking through these halls, we admire the stucco and parquet flooring, forgetting that for someone, these walls were the boundaries of their world. The things they used, fans, gloves, boxes, retain the warmth of their hands and the coldness of their loneliness. Each antique item carries the silent story of its owner. Their letters and diaries, those that have survived, are read today as novels about survival in golden settings. We hear their voices a century later, and these voices are full of dignity and hidden drama. They tell us that true happiness cannot be bought, built, or worn on a finger. It is a lesson they learned too late, but passed on to us. Many of these women remained unknown, dissolving into the shadows of their famous husbands. Their contributions to culture, charity, and art are often underestimated or forgotten. But it was they who created the atmosphere of sophistication and style that we still admire today. They were the invisible foundation of that glittering society. Today, when we watch films or series about that era, we should see more than just the romance. Behind every beautiful frame lies a real human destiny, often tragic. Understanding this makes our perception of history deeper and more honest. We pay tribute to those who lived in golden cages without a key. These women, whose names are carved on marble tombstones, have finally found the peace they did not know in life. The silence that surrounded them in their huge houses has now become eternal. But their stories continue to resonate, reminding us of true values. They are gone, but they left us with a warning that all that glitters is not gold. We conclude our journey into a past full of glamour and shadows. I hope this glimpse behind the scenes of a beautiful life has made you think about many things. Their lives were a lesson for which they paid with their own lives. We have lifted the heavy velvet curtains that hid the true lives of women in the Gilded Age and late Victorian era. What we have seen proves that wealth and titles were never a guarantee of happiness, but often became nothing more than a beautiful backdrop for profound loneliness. These women, bound by corsets and social conventions, showed incredible strength of spirit in trying to preserve themselves in a world that wanted to see them only as beautiful dolls. Their stories are a quiet but powerful reminder of the value of freedom, sincerity, and the right to be oneself, a right for which they paid with their youth and dreams. What parallels do you think can be drawn between their fates and the lives of modern women striving for external success? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new stories.